Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this professional learning opportunity. I am Scott Mathias from NCEA, and I will be your host today. Just a few housekeeping notes as people are joining. If you have questions during the presentation, feel free to use the Q&A or chat windows. We will be monitoring the questions and we'll try to answer them all in the allotted time. After today's webinar, I will email everyone a link to the recording as well as an online survey. Once you fill out the survey, a certificate of completion for the webinar will be emailed to you. Today's webinar, Equity and Text Complexity, Why It Matters Now More Than Ever, is being led by Dr. Lynn Coolidge, Director of Early Learning with NWEA. Before I turn it over to our panelists, let us begin in prayer. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Lord, I pray that my heart will become an instrument of your own merciful heart. In any way that I lack the empathy and compassion flowing from your heart, bring me healing. And in every way that I have been blessed to experience the struggles and joys of others on account of sharing in your mercy, I thank you. Lord, my deep desire is to share in your life and love so that my heart may become like unto yours. Jesus, I trust in you. Amen. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Lynn, thank you for joining us today.
Hi, everyone. And yes, thank you, Scott. You're so welcome. It is such a pleasure to be with all of you. As Scott mentioned, I am Lynn Coolidge. I'm the Director of Early Learning at NWEA. I am coming to you from Canton, Ohio. So I'm an hour southeast of Cleveland, and just happy to be with you today to talk about early reading, best practices in terms of instruction and assessments. And I'm going to share a little bit of data specific to our map reading fluency assessment. So hopefully you will walk away from this today with a little bit more knowledge. So what I'd like to do is just level set us first. And I have this reading quiz. I have 5 statements. I'm not going to ask you to respond to a poll. So just as you're sitting there viewing the webinar, I want you to think about each statement and whether the statement is true or false. So let's go ahead with the first one. The first one is phonemic awareness. So that's the understanding of the sounds that letters make. Phonemic awareness is a consequence, not a cause, of reading acquisition. True or false? So the answer is false. Phonemic awareness, which is actually part of the larger umbrella known as phonological awareness, is actually a precursor. It is one of the most important precursor skills for reading acquisition. All right, the second statement, research supports matching students' instructional reading levels to those just right books. So what do you think, true or false? Answer is false. Now, to be completely transparent, in 2001, I had transitioned from being a French elementary teacher in Atlanta, Georgia, moved back home to Ohio, and I was teaching first grade, regular first grade in English. And it was common practice for me to implement some reading screeners, determine students' instructional reading levels, and then pull those leveled texts to use in guided reading. If we fast forward now over 2 decades, what we know from research is that is not a best practice. There's a time and place for leveled text, but what research is very clear on is that students need to be reading grade level text with scaffolds, and we're going to talk more about that. Third statement, skilled reading involves using syntactic, so think grammar, and semantic cues, so think context clues in the passage, picture clues, etc. So skilled reading involves using syntactic and semantic cues to guess words, and good readers make many mistakes as they read authentic text. So true or false? Survey says false. So actually, what we know from the science of reading and how children learn to read is that they need to be taught specifically and explicitly graphophonic skills. They need to understand how how certain letters make certain sounds, and when combined together, those phonemes make words. And that whole process is actually known as orthographic mapping. And that has to be key. Not that using grammar and context clues aren't helpful or important. They're all part of students using their metacognition and kind of allowing them to check their decoding skills. But what we have to be clear about is that they have to be explicitly taught graphophonic skills. All right, number 4. Short-term tutoring for struggling readers can get them caught up with their peers, and the gains will be sustained. Well, survey says false. You're probably noticing a pattern here. While short-term tutoring can be helpful for some students, what we know from research is if we look at the broad stroke, this is not always the case. And what we have to understand is the importance of that core tier 1 reading instruction. It has to be rock solid for all students, because when students start to be pulled out, those gains may appear to be solid and students may sustain them for a while. But what we have to do is close gaps early so that students don't need to be pulled out for those interventions. And that happens when we have good rock solid tier 1. All right, last statement. If it's in the curriculum, then children will learn it, and a balanced reading curriculum is ideal. Well, as I said, there is a pattern here. Survey says false. Just because it's in a curriculum certainly doesn't mean that children will learn it, doesn't even mean that it was taught, right? This is where we need rock star teachers to show up. What's also important to note is that a balanced reading curriculum may not be ideal if teachers are not explicitly and systematically teaching the big 5 reading ideas for all students. And we're going to dive into that a little bit. All right, so let's now look at some of the data. So if we look at data from the National Center for Education Statistics, this is a data warehouse, and there's all kinds of information in there about all things related to students and instruction, et cetera. But what I've done is pull out 3 interesting, or at least what I think are interesting pieces. The first one is according to 2019, which is the most recent data. Only 35% of 4th graders nationally, regardless of your state, but nationally can read at or above the proficient level. And actually, if we look at data from 2017, we had 37% of 4th graders who could read at or above proficient level. So clearly we're moving in the wrong direction. Second, 82% of students eligible for free or reduced lunch aren't reading at or above proficient levels. So those students who are already marginalized are now not reading proficiently. And so it's kind of like a double whammy for those students, unfortunately. And finally, of the 10 to 15% of students who we know will inevitably drop out of school nationwide, over 75% of those students will report difficulties learning to read. And so as a former educator, director of curriculum in 2 school districts, I always had to save some of my instructional budget for things like summer school, after school programming, dropout prevention, dropout recovery. And what I really wanted to do was just front load those resources into that K-3 space, because we know that research shows if we can close gaps early, we're unlikely to need things like dropout recovery programs. So here's some more data. I think this is really interesting. So what we know from our NAEP data is that there was a study conducted to determine any potential growth in 4th grade reading scores across the country from 2017 to 2019. Well, what we know is that 17 states, including my home state of Ohio, saw decreases in their scores from 2017 to 2019. 34 states saw no significant change, but what's really interesting is that Mississippi is the only state that showed any improvement. And we're going to talk about Mississippi in just a few moments, so I want you to keep that in mind. What we know specifically about those students, so those third and fourth graders, 75 to 90% of them who do not achieve reading proficiency, specifically on those high stakes reading assessments, what we know is they exhibit significant gaps in accurate word recognition. So think phonics and vocabulary skills, as well as fluency. So that's important because I want us to start thinking about how we're teaching these particular foundational skills like phonics, vocabulary, and fluency. Because 75 to 90% of those students have gaps in those areas that need to be closed, particularly in that K-3 space. This is also a really interesting study, and I'm going to ask you to remember what we learned about the state of Mississippi. The National Council for Teacher Quality published an article, research in 2020, and what they did is they looked at universities and colleges throughout the country, and they analyzed those education courses for pre-service teachers, right, for the teaching of reading. And what they looked at from 2013 to 2020 is the amount of emphasis or coverage on how to teach the big 5 reading ideas identified by the National Reading Panel. And you can see those big 5 ideas there at the bottom of the table on the x-axis: phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. So take a look at this. One thing you'll notice when you look at the bar graph is we've made some improvements, right, since 2013 up to 2020. So the amount of coverage on how to teach those big 5 ideas has increased over those years. But you'll recall that I talked about phonemic awareness, that skill being a precursor skill for reading success, for reading proficiency. And notice that even in 2020, only 51% of those college university courses are providing adequate instruction in phonemic awareness. So think about that. You know, when we hire our teachers, especially in that K-3 space, to teach our students, how well prepared are they to teach these foundational skills? Look at fluency. We know fluency, based on data, is a key important factor. And students often have gaps in fluency, and only 53% of colleges are providing adequate coverage. Here's something interesting. The state of Mississippi came in first. So when the National Council of Teacher Quality analyzed all of those pre-service education courses, they rank ordered states. Mississippi came in number 1, Utah was second. So is that perhaps any indication as to why the students in Mississippi showed growth from 2017 to 2019? I'm not sure, but it certainly causes us to wonder, right? Here's one additional study you might be familiar with, and this is a study called the Opportunity Myth that was published by the New Teacher Project in 2018. And here's what they discovered. They observed classrooms of students, and what they noted is that those observed students were meeting class expectations 71% of the time. So, okay, so about 3/4 of the time students are meeting those expectations. But then those researchers analyzed those classroom expectations in terms of state standards, grade level standards. And what they discovered is that those same students were only meeting grade level standards 17% of the time. So, you know, if you think about when we reference or researchers, thought leaders talk about the achievement gap, what we really have is an opportunity gap. So If students aren't being asked to meet grade level standards, then it's really hard for them, say on those high stakes reading assessments, to meet those grade level expectations and really become reading proficient if they were never held accountable to those throughout the school year. So something to think about. So let's talk about this notion of equity and what it means and what it doesn't mean. So first and foremost, it doesn't mean lowering expectations, right? We might have thought that to be the case, right? We want to make things accessible, but not too challenging for students. So without even thinking about it, sometimes we lower those expectations and we don't hold students accountable to grade level standards. But if we think about it, we have to build equity using high quality instructional and assessment materials. We have to have high expectations, not just classroom expectations, but grade level expectations. And we have to have high quality instruction. We need our teachers to have the professional learning they need. And those teachers in that K-3 space need to be rock star reading teachers. What we know about equitable reading practices is that the goals and expectations have to be the same for all students, but the supports that students need to achieve those goals need to be different based on students' needs, based on their skills gaps. And that's hard. I will be the first one, I'm a former first, second, third grade teacher. No one is here saying that is easy. It is very hard to differentiate based on each student's skills gaps. My first year teaching first grade, I had 27 first graders. So that's a challenging task, but it's what our students need, and it's part of building equitable reading practices. So let's talk about complex text. And when I mention complex text, I'm talking about those grade level texts, right? Why are they such a big deal? Well, for three main reasons, I think. Number one, vocabulary. Think about it. How can we introduce our students to new words from text where they already know most of the words, right? If they're second, third graders and they're reading text at the first grade level, they're not getting exposed to that grade level vocabulary that they need. What about syntactic complexity? We know that written language, right, when we're reading a book, it tends to use much more complex syntax than our oral language. We need our students to be able to decode that complex syntax, those semicolons and colons and quotation marks and commas and compound sentences. All of those things are important for them to be able to read. And then finally, content knowledge. In order to build content knowledge, right, we have to keep introducing them to new content. So if your third graders are constantly reading text below grade level, but maybe at their instructional level, then it's really hard for them to build new content if they're reading content knowledge that's at, say, first grade level. So I really have, I love my job. I have the great fortune of speaking to teachers all over the country. And no matter where I go, what state I'm in, or what school I'm speaking with, teachers are always asking me, Lynn, what if grade level isn't the student's level, right? So what if the student's Lexile is 300 and that grade level text that they're supposed to be able to read is at the 600 level? Shouldn't I just give them an easier book, like pick a book at their instructional level at the 300 level? Well, what I would first suggest is we change the question to what if grade level isn't the student's level yet? So what if that level is 600? We have to get the student up to that level. We can't just give them a text at their instructional level every day of the week to read. So we have to provide scaffolding or support. And what I want you to know is that fluency instruction needs to be part of that scaffolding for every student who is reading connected text. And that's going to be key. So I want to dig a little deeper into kind of debunking, I guess, this myth about equitable reading practices and the instructional reading level. So I want to look at 3 different researchers, thought leaders here. And the first is actually Sigmund Freud from the 1940s. And if we look back to his research and all of his work, that is really where we begin to see this notion of the independent, instructional, and frustrational level text kind of come about, kind of the precipice. So oftentimes I will hear teachers say, well, we don't want to give students texts that are too challenging for them. Shouldn't we just give them a text at their instructional reading level so that they don't become frustrated? And I've also had educators say to me, well, if I give students texts that are too hard, that are at their frustrational level, they're going to misbehave, right? They're going to become disengaged, frustrated, they're going to act out. Well, actually, there is a researcher, Linda Gambrell, we'll see her on the next slide. She and her colleagues conducted a really interesting study. They analyzed those texts that students were given in classrooms, in guided reading groups, and they looked at students' reactions and their behavior. And what they noticed that students who were misbehaving or who were disengaged were given texts, some of those students, at their frustrational level. So those grade level texts appeared to be too hard and they were acting out. So what the researchers did is they changed the text level. And so they gave students texts that were much easier, maybe even at their instructional reading level. But what the researchers discovered is that those same students were still misbehaving. So that text level had nothing to do with their behavior or their disengagement. In addition, Linda Gambrell and her thought leaders, if you're not familiar with her work, Google her. She's done a lot of work in that motivation space. And so there's this notion that students won't be motivated to read if the book is too hard. So we have to give them texts that are easier for them to read at their instructional level. Well, what Linda Gambrell and colleagues found out is that that actually wasn't true at all. And it's a much more complicated answer. In fact, when teachers give students grade level texts, right, rich vocabulary, complex syntax, content knowledge, and they provide a purpose for reading, they front load with vocabulary, they review phonics rules, they really provide that support, then students are motivated to read because they have the support that they need. The last thought leader is Tim Shanahan. If you're not familiar with him or you don't follow his blogs, I do encourage you to Google him and sign up for his blogs. He writes significantly about instructional reading levels and those types of practices that really don't build equitable practices in our classroom. And so what Tim Shanahan talks about is that, for decades, we have thought that giving students text at their instructional level would close gaps. What we know from research for over 2 decades now is that is not at all the case. And in fact, what happens is those gaps continue to widen. So if you think about it, if students have to take high stakes tests, right, at the end of the year for reading, they are often asked to read text at grade level, not text below grade level. And if they've spent maybe at least 3 days a week in a guided reading group using text at their instructional level that are below grade level, then they're not supported, they're not well equipped to suddenly read a text at grade level and take a high stakes test. So we've got to change up our practices. So I do encourage you to look at his blog. He writes some really great articles on how to teach with grade level text. All right, so I want to just kind of look at reading fluency in particular. And if we look at just general Common Core state standards, many states have their own standards, but the reading fluency standards are pretty similar despite the state that you live in. And if we look at the reading fluency standards for grades 1 through 5, I wanted to pull out 2 bullet points here. The standards state that We need to help students develop and sustain foundational language skills, listening, speaking, reading, writing, and thinking, including fluency. And that students need to read grade level text with fluency and comprehension. And they're expected to use appropriate fluency when reading grade level text. So nowhere in the state standards does it talk about using text below grade level. So here comes the $1 million question. You're probably wondering, how can we help students read rich text with understanding? What if they are comprehending below grade level? What do we do? So the first thing that we need to do is make sure that our teachers, predominantly those K-3 teachers, understand the big 5 reading ideas identified by the National Reading Panel: phonological awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. All of these skills, these ideas or constructs, need to be explicitly and systematically taught. And that's important. Oftentimes we hear about explicitly and systematically teaching phonics, but I would caution you to be certain that you're teaching all of the big 5 explicitly, because they're all very important. What's also important is that we understand the simple view of reading by Goff and Tunmer. And what the simple view of reading says is that reading comprehension is the ultimate goal. It's not reading right. It's not how fast students read. It's how well they're able to understand what it is we want them to read. And reading comprehension is really a product of these 2 important domains: the decoding domain and the language comprehension domain. So let's break this apart a little bit. When we talk about the decoding domain, we're talking about 2 of the big 5 ideas: phonological awareness, right? The sounds that letters make, and the ability to manipulate those sounds. And then we're talking about phonics, word recognition, right? Understanding the letters and the sounds that they make, that orthographic mapping. And then when we talk about language comprehension, we're talking about vocabulary, grammar or syntax, and we're talking about content knowledge. And I also want to be clear, right, that every child brings themselves to that text. They bring their experiences, that their personal vocabulary they have, they bring their whole selves to that text. And we need to make sure we're constantly adding to their virtual vocabulary backpack and to all of their background knowledge. But there is one important piece of this simple view of reading, and I actually have a colleague here at NWEA who calls this important piece the yellow brick road, and that's fluency. Fluency really acts as that road or that brick. Once students have mapped those letters to sounds, and they bring their whole selves, their vocabulary, their content knowledge to that text, and they start to read, connected text, that's when fluency needs to kick in, and it needs to be taught. Students need to understand how to read with automaticity and accuracy and with prosody. And it's fluency that enables students to inevitably better comprehend what it is they're reading. Now, what I want to share with you is this graphic or matrix here. Now, for most states, there are exceptions, but for most states, each of the big 5 reading ideas that you see there along that first column, they are predominantly the focus of reading instruction in those grades that you see listed there, right? So for example, phonological awareness is that precursor skill, and it's really hit hard in kindergarten and first grade. Notice though, if you will, that comes second grade in most states, it's not part of second grade state standards, because the assumption is that it's been taught, it's now secure, and these students are ready to start developing things like advanced phonics skills, multi-syllable words, really focusing on fluency, etc. But what happens is those second and third graders who haven't secured phonological awareness or beginning phonics skills become those second, third, fourth, etc., those students who are now not comprehending at grade level, are not fluent at grade level. And those teachers often struggle to determine how to close those gaps. We can't just teach comprehension skills to close those phonological awareness gaps. So that's where we've got to go back. We've got to have data that highlights where those gaps are, and then we have to have interventions in place to close them. Because if we don't close them, those gaps widen and students continue to have difficulty with fluency and comprehension all the way through middle school and high school. So, why does fluency matter so much? It is so important that not only we have instructional practices that target fluency, but also assessment. So I want to spell out some research that we have on fluency, and then I want to talk about some instructional practices for fluency. And then I want to look at data and what kind of data you should require of any assessments you're using so that you can intervene appropriately. All right, I apologize. There we go. My mouse was stuck there. So here's what we know about fluency instruction. There was a synthesis of research from 2001 to 2014 from Stevens, Walker, and Vaughn. And what they did is they looked at the effects of reading fluency interventions on not only reading fluency, but reading comprehension performance of elementary students with learning disabilities. And here's what they concluded. Fluency interventions improved both reading fluency skills and reading comprehension skills. So when we focus and we, really fine-tune fluency instruction, it helped with reading comprehension and fluency skills. What else do we know? Kuhn, Schwanenflugel, and Morris published a study in 2006, and what they determined is that fluency instruction that specifically emphasized extensive oral reading of, wait for it, grade level text using supports, right, to promote reading development in young learners actually did support them, improve their reading. And what they also discovered is that extensive oral reading mattered. Level of text did not. So think about that for a moment. Why not create equitable reading practices by letting students read texts that are rich in vocabulary, syntax, and content knowledge, right? Expose them to all that good, rich grade level stuff while you're developing their fluency. Again, if we look at Common Core state standards for reading fluency, right? Read grade level texts across multiple genres, focusing on accuracy, automaticity, prosody, using context to confirm or self-correct, right? So that's where that metacognition comes into play, those syntactic cues, those semantic cues. So I could spend, and I know my colleagues at NWA know this, I could spend half a day or a whole day talking about reading fluency instructional practices, but here's just a snippet. Reading fluency needs to be explicitly taught, and it takes some time, as much as maybe 15, 20 minutes of your reading instruction per day. And you see there bulleted some instructional practices that are evidence-based practices, like modeling fluent reading, interactive read-alouds, practices like choral reading, echo reading, phrase reading, partner, repeated reading. And my favorite is the fluency development lesson. The fluency development lesson was actually my doctoral research. I used it with my first, second, third graders. I used it with refugee children. Tim Rosinski is one of the authors, so you can certainly Google that and find more information about the fluency development lesson that highlights fluency instruction, actually instruction that encompasses all of the big 5 reading ideas within a 15 to 20 minute lesson using grade level text, particularly poetry. So if that's of something that's of interest to you, I encourage you to look into that. So some of you might be saying, okay, I get it. Fluency instruction is important, right? It needs to be part of that scaffolding we provide students who need that support, those interventions. But what about students that aren't reading connected text yet? Maybe they're kindergarten, early first grade. Well, that's important that we call that out. Fluency instruction really works for those students, well, who are reading connected text, meaning they already understand the relationship between phonemes, those sounds that letters make, and graphemes, the actual letter. You heard me talk about that orthographic mapping. So those students who have already secured that, that's when fluency instruction kicks in. Otherwise, if students don't yet recognize their letters and their sounds, what we run the risk of is, if we're having them read a simple text over and over again, they might just be memorizing it, or they're recognizing certain word shapes, or they're using pictures, right? And those aren't helpful. We need to make sure that their graphophonic skills are solid. So that's important. So let's talk about different types of texts, right? So if you are a kindergarten teacher or a first grade teacher for students who haven't yet mastered those decoding skills, you still need to expose them to rich language, right? Vocabulary, content, etc. How do you do that? Well, there is a time and place for both what we call decodable texts, right? Those texts like the one you see on the screen, SAMSAT, MATSAT, SAMSAT. Okay, that text serves a purpose for that kindergarten student who needs to practice those decoding skills and those particular phonemes. That definitely serves a purpose, but it's not introducing students to rich vocabulary or content knowledge, right? That's where those read alouds come into play. If we look at a text like Last Stop on Market Street, this is something you would want to read aloud to those kindergarten students, for example. The outside air smelled like freedom, but it also smelled like rain, which freckled CJ's shirt and dripped down his nose. That's just such rich language they need exposed to that they certainly couldn't read or decode on their own. Well, what needs to adjust, right? So let's say I'm a second grade teacher and I have students who aren't yet, at that point where fluency instruction is working for them because they haven't mastered decoding yet. They don't understand the phonemes and the graphemes yet. Well, we have to adjust our instruction in intervention for those students. And it's important that we adjust or we differentiate instruction based on skills and skills gaps. So there are two specific skills. First, we have those constrained skills, right? So the alphabet is a constrained skill. There are only 26 letters in our English alphabet. Once students have learned those, that's it. That is like a one and done skill. And if you have second graders that haven't mastered those yet, they need to, right? Then we have what we call unconstrained skills. Things like critical thinking. Those are not one and done. If you look at our standards, K through 12, you're going to see critical thinking in there because it's a skill that needs to be nurtured and taught all throughout a child's educational career. These are skills that increase in rigor with each grade level. Just to give you an indication, if we look at Stahl's graphic here, we see constrained skills listed in order of most constrained, like name writing or letter shaping, to least constrained, like oral reading fluency. And then, of course, we have unconstrained skills. Vocabulary. We're constantly going to develop students' vocabulary. It's not one and done, right? All the way down to critical thinking, motivation, attitudes, etc. So it's important to understand the two types of skills and determine where students are along these continuums, because wherever they are is where we need to be able to intervene. All right, so let's talk about assessment data and how can assessment data really support your action plan? Well, first we have to answer the question, right? Why does assessment matter? There were so many educators that we partner with here at NWEA who, really reached out to us during the COVID pandemic and said, we still need assessment data. We have to be able to teach, and we can't teach without that data. And they were absolutely correct, because assessment marks the beginning of your instructional journey. It's the starting line, right? If we don't know where student skills gaps are, it makes it really hard to instruct and almost impossible to intervene, right? If we're teaching second grade and we don't know that students still have gaps in phonemic awareness, how are we going to close them? Remember what we learned in kindergarten, right? Most of us learned the importance of sharing. Whether or not we practice it is a different story, but it's important to share data, right? In a meaningful way, in an appropriate way, with that student and with the student's family. They need to know where their skills gaps are, and they need to know what your plan is to close those gaps. And then we're all on the same team. I really, really encourage you to share with colleagues. And while some of you may be sitting out there thinking, well, yeah, that's a no-brainer, we do that. Not everyone does, right? So if you are on a team of third grade teachers and you've discovered that you have students who have gaps in phonological awareness, share with your team on how you're intervening to close those, right? Knowledge is powerful and everyone can benefit. So how do you select an appropriate assessment? I'm certainly aware that some of you out there may not be using our MAP growth or MAP reading fluency assessment from NWEA, and that's fine. But how do you go about selecting what is an appropriate assessment? Answer these questions. What is it that you want to know? Not just what do you need to know? What does my school district or my school or my principal or my state Department of Education say that I need to know? But what is it I want to know, right? How will the data I get help me become a better teacher, help me know how to intervene? Why do I want to know this? And again, the answer cannot be, well, because I'm told I have to have data on X, Y, and Z, right? Your answer has to be more robust than that. It has to be because you will then know how to intervene. And how can you best discover it? Do you have reading screeners that are providing you with data for second, third graders who have gaps in foundational skills? Those are things that you'll want to answer. When you're looking at your reading screeners, you're going to want to get data on how well students are reading with automaticity, accuracy, and prosody. Those are the three components of fluency. Can students comprehend? Because that's the goal. What and how much scaffolding is needed for students to read grade level text? Okay, that's the type of information you need. And are students growing in their ability to decode harder text with comprehension, right? Are we increasing the rigor of the text, checking not only for fluency, but also for comprehension? Go back to this simple view of reading. Do you have data that will help you uncover weak links? If you are a second grade teacher, do you have data that lets you know whether or not students have gaps in phonological awareness? So what I'm going to do is show you some oral reading data that we provide with our MAP reading fluency assessment. If you're not using MAP reading fluency, think about the reading screener that you are using and if it's giving you this kind of data. So for students who are reading, it's very helpful to have data not only on their oral reading rate, their comprehension, etc., but also on a newer metric known as the oral reading level or lexile. Metametrics created a new lexile, and it's an oral reading lexile. And essentially, what I'm going to show you here is a graphic that explains how they created this. What they did is they looked at passages at a typical grade level, say for second grade, and they analyzed how difficult those passages are to decode, not comprehend, but to decode with automaticity and accuracy. And then they analyzed how well, in fact, students do decode those passages when reading out loud. And they provide NWEA with a Lexile oral reading measure. So back to that report, this is Samantha's Lexile. She has an oral reading measure of 240 units below beginner reader. She's a second grader. So what does that tell that classroom teacher who knows he needs to teach reading with grade level text? Well, it tells that teacher how much scaffolding Samantha will need, because Metametrics analyze typical second grade text and they have oral readability lexiles from 380 to 580. So think about that science text, social studies, the story in the reading anthology. If they're at, say, in the fall of a 380 lexile, Samantha's going to need a lot of support: partner reading, choral reading, echo reading, right? Reviewing phonics rules. Lots of opportunities to reread that passage so that she can be successful when she needs to decode it independently. With map reading fluency, teachers get to play back the recordings of students reading. So if you're familiar with the assessment, students wear a microphone embedded headset and they actually get to read passages. So we provide the recording. Teachers can also choose to hand score this and make notes about the student's prosody or their miscues, etc. This is a class report. So do you have a reading screener that provides data on how well your students can decode passages at grade level? This report does, and it shows you there, if you reference the blue arrow, it indicates to the classroom teacher how much support some students will need decoding grade level passages as opposed to others. Now, what if your students aren't reading connected text yet? Or what if they are second graders, but they have gaps in phonological awareness or beginning phonics? Does your screener provide that data? Well, Map Reading Fluency has a foundational skills assessment, and you're seeing here on your screen a report. And what we provide is data on the decoding skills as well as language comprehension. So we have performance levels indicating that this student is below grade level in phonological awareness. They're approaching in phonics. Language comprehension seems to be secure. So I'm going to focus in that decoding domain when I look at my interventions. In addition, we highlight each student's zone of proximal development, and we populate just right activities aligned to the student's skills gap. So this happens to be an activity from the Florida Center for Reading Research. So our teachers can print this off and even send it home with families so that families can work on helping to close those skills gaps as well. So, does your reading screener provide you with data that highlights all of the big 5 reading ideas? If not, think about how important that kind of data is. And is there a way that you can choose assessments that give you that data you need? So as we wrap up, this question is, as I mentioned earlier, is often asked of me. Well, if you're telling me that an equitable reading practice means that I have to teach with grade level text, should I even bother to level a student? Do I find their instructional reading level? Well, what's the answer to that? Well, first off, I would tell you that leveling, determining a student's instructional reading level, is not a bad thing. But the question you need to ask is, what's your purpose for leveling? If it's so that you can limit access to grade level text, then you need to rethink that practice. I actually also wrote a blog, so you can Google Teach, Learn, Grow, NWEA, and if you search on my name, you'll find a blog I wrote about how to use leveled text most appropriately in a classroom. while you're teaching with grade level text. So that might be of interest to you. Second, use your data. In particular, if you're using map reading fluency, use that oral reading level that we provide to determine how much support students need to be successful at reading grade level text. And then finally, focus on evidence-based fluency practices, because fluency needs to be part of your intervention for those students who are reading connected text. And you need to use text at grade level. So I think we have a few minutes left, maybe about 10 minutes. So I'll pause here, open it up to any questions that we might have. I don't know, Jessica, I think you're on. If you notice any questions and you'd like to read them to me, or if anyone would like to come off mute, if you're able, and ask, I'd be happy to answer. What we have here.
Yes, anyone who has a question, feel free to drop it in the Q&A window or the chat window. Either is fine.
Lynn, I didn't see any questions. I did drop in the chat the link to how to use Level Readers blog.
Yeah, I just saw that. Thank you, Jessica. I appreciate that. Awesome teamwork. Yeah. And, you know, if there's any question, please just interrupt me. You know, equitable reading practices is really kind of about a mindset shift, right? As I mentioned earlier, in 2001, I was finding students instructional reading levels and limiting their access to grade level text, you know, and it's not because I was a bad teacher. I was doing what I thought was best practice. I was doing what I was taught, even when I was a university professor. Complete transparency. This is a practice that we taught our pre-service reading teachers to do. But, you know, like I said, fast forward 20 years, and the research is really shining a light on this practice that is not closing gaps. And so, you know, it's just like RTI, MTSS practices. You got to take those temperature checks. And if what we're doing isn't working, we need to rethink it, and we need to head down a different path if appropriate.
Okay. Yes. Tomorrow I will send a link to the recording to everyone who's registered for this webinar. And I will also send a survey. And if you need a certificate of completion for this webinar, I will include that survey. And then once you complete the survey, and a certificate will be emailed to you. If you want to check out our future webinars, you can go to ncea.org/webinars. Lynn, I wanted to thank you so much for being with us today. Really interesting presentation. I was a language major in college, so all of the discussion about phonemes and acquisition really hit home with me. I don't know about our attendees, but it was a very interesting topic for me. So
great. Yeah, Scott, thank you. It was a pleasure to get to speak with your educators.
And thank you to all of our attendees, and we'll see you on the next webinar. Have a blessed day.
Bye-bye. Thanks, everyone.